Hello. I'll put that down.
Should I hold the mic for you while you pose?
No, I'm not going to pose. Hi, my name's April Staines. I am a maker. I'm I guess, a massive nerd, and one of the things I really like making is, I like making science fiction props. So, we've all seen Aliens? Yes, those who haven't. Sorry. I had someone today at work say, I've never seen that, I'm not sure what that is, and I was like, oh, we failed. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about, this has got a lot of echo and I'm not really used to this mic, but 3D printing, crafting, props, and female makers. So it's 3D printed crafts, so it's all about making stuff. I love making things. It's one of the things I love the most. But rarely in crafts do you use one specific tool or technique or tool. And 3D printing in craft, we basically use it to complement craft and making. It doesn't really replace it. And makers often augment 3D printed items with other things, like I use paint and fillers and other composite materials. So it's not really just about the 3D printed item itself, because this isn't really about just 3D printing. So you've got to really think about what it is that you're making, whether it's something that's small and detailed, whether it's things like jewelry or war game miniatures, larger things like costume props, whether they're ornamental display or whether they actually need to be functional. A lot of things can be all of those. And is the 3D printed output the final product, or is it really just part of the process? Is it a prototype? Is it something for a mold? So I'll just talk a little bit first about 3D printing parts for smaller crafts. So the 3D printing process has limitations when it comes to quality that can be achieved using a maker's, cheap machines that are available to most makers and crafters. We can't all really afford the high, cost machines. So, and there are other things where you can use 3D printed bureaus, which can often be a very good option, particularly because bureaus tend to charge per cubic centimetre. So if you want to make small stuff that's highly detailed, and you don't really have a machine that's super, super detailed yourself, because you might just have an FDM type printer that just extrudes plastic, you don't want to, and you can't really afford anything bigger or better, a bureau is actually quite good. But it's often actually still quite important to prototype. I actually found this that using things like shapeways to print stuff for me, or bureaus, was actually very slow. Like the turnaround is ridiculous. Like you've got to wait 2 weeks minimum to get something. So it's not actually all that practical. And there's also considerations on how you actually print stuff. So the angle which you would print, for example, an item on a standard FDM type printer, when prints extrudes plastic, is actually really important. You can control the vertical height quite easily, but you can't necessarily control the nozzle width or the material that you're printing with. It's whatever it is. Yes, you can get smaller nozzles, you can get better material, but you still have limitations. And you also need to have a look at what are actually trying to output. So is it something that you're going to necessarily use as the final product, or is it going to be something that you're going to use to make a mold? So here's some examples. I'm a bit crazy, I guess. I love Star Wars, a big Star Wars fan, and I like Hello Kitty, because Hello Kitty's kind of just a bit crazy and doesn't really make sense because it hasn't got a mouth. So I actually mashed this up. I made some jewellery, and it was a mash-up between Boba Fett and Hello Kitty, right? Because why not, right? And at first I was like, well, I'm just going to make a necklace, and yes, because I think this is cool. So I needed to get the size right, and I also needed to see what it looked like, because the first model, the solid model, didn't really look right when you printed it. It looked okay on the 3D model, but until you actually printed and you wore it, it didn't really work. The actual sort of, the ones that you see here are actually just printed on a wrap, and actually this was done a few years ago, so that's like on a 0.5 nozzle. It was a lot of playing around and in ABS to get it to look like that. But it did work, and it was reasonable quality. Now this is that same thing that's actually been printed in gold-plated brass, 3 shapeways, and it cost me $30. Right, but I got the science right and got a thing, and I just printed it out. So, and just an example of using a bureau is actually really cost effective. Now, I'm not a jeweler, but I made some jewelry, and it's not just cheap, crappy jewelry that you give a kid. This is like something that you could wear. Now, you could do it with anything else. It doesn't have to be Hello Kitty or Boba Kitty or whatever it is. Not really sure what to call it, to be honest. I'm sort of violating 2 copyrights at the one time. Okay, so 3D printed 3D printed parts for larger crafts. Now, I considered this. This was, up until recently, one of the bigger things I had printed, and I can probably hand that around. Try not to drop it, that bit there can break off. But you can have a play. Don't walk outside, you probably get shot. Yeah, so there's limitations in the size and quality that are available to makers. It's the opposite problem that you have with smaller stuff. We can't all really afford like a giant machine where I can actually print that out in one go. Now, I know they exist, but they cost a whole lot more than I can afford. And 3D printing bureaus, while they can be cost effective for small stuff, because they charge by cubic centimetre, it's ridiculously expensive to print stuff that size. Now, that probably cost me in filament about $30 to $40 worth of filament. I costed that to print 3 shapeways in the flexible white plastic, and I think it was over $1,000. Right, so it's just not practical. But you've got to think about how you're actually going to make it. So one of the things is you've got to make it as a composite. It has to be parts. You have to be able to break it up and then put it back together. And now we've actually got this problem, is how do you actually do that? What's the most effective way of breaking things up? Again, the angle of the print is actually really important. So you want to try, with something like this, you don't want to use supports all the way up the top of the model because it's going to really slow down the print, and half your print's actually just going to be support, and you're going to have to throw it all away. So turning things upside down, putting things on their side, and depending on the material, you can actually achieve fairly large models. Now, I print in ABS, which is notoriously hard to print with, but I need strength, because if I print that in PLA and dropped it, it will shatter. Right, and then it'd still probably break, but you can at least fix it. And I find I can just print really tall, but I need to be able to break things up. And I don't tend to have the shrinkage problems with ABS if I print tall. So your considerations of the angle, and again, you need to now look at what you're trying to output. Are you going to output something from a mould, or is it actually the final product? In this case, it's the final product. I don't think I'd make a mould that big. It would just be a real pain. But here's an example of where we actually did make a mould. This is a helmet. Now, it takes forever to print a helmet. It's actually quite big. So it's not necessarily practical to print a helmet every time you want to give someone a Boba Fett helmet. But incidentally, I like Boba Fett. So you print it out in segments, it gets stuck together, and we end up using traditional moulding and casting techniques. So here we've gone and finished the helmet, sanded it, smoothed it, painted it, and now created a silicon mould. Basically poured silicon over the top of it, hardens. Now we can just use fiberglass or whatever else that you want to use to actually make a copy of that. So 3D printing materials. The two that are most common, obviously, PLA and ABS. PLA is dimensionally stable. So if you're doing something like a mould, that mould was printed in PLA. It just makes it easier when it's that big to just print things in PLA. You don't have the same sort of problems. ABS is much stronger, and I think it's actually easier to work with. So you can sand ABS, you can weld it, you can make multi-part things much easier with ABS than you can with PLA. And the welds are ridiculously strong. Actually, most of the time when I weld things together, literally all I do is I get a saucer with acetone, I dip the 2 sides of the ABS in the acetone, and I just shove them together, and that's it. And that weld is normally stronger than the print itself. If it breaks, it's normally in the print, delaminating, not the actual glue point. So So I find that's actually my preferred material for making props. So that's actually the same blaster. That's what it looked like. And I actually just used up all the ends of spools I had. So I just had a whole lot of ends of spools. I actually have a little side business where I 3D print stuff for people. For some reason, they didn't like those colours. So I had a lot of those colours lying around. So I thought it was quite nice. So finishing tricks. So one of the things is you want to try and get rid of print lines. Now that was printed about 4 years ago on a really old rep wrap that had really bad, like you could actually see the lines in it. And you know, it had threaded rods, and the threaded rods actually come out in the print. So I have replaced those with trapezoid lead screws, and the difference it's made to that print is ridiculous. But one of the easiest things to do, rather than having a whole lot of finishing that you have to do and a whole lot of sanding, is to just print at a high resolution. You print at a high resolution, it makes all the subsequent steps so much easier. Now, it does take forever. So if you print 100 micron, it's going to take forever. I normally print about 200. Spray filler putty, amazing stuff. You can get it at Repco. Comes in this quite a large can. You don't want primer putty, you just want putty. And it's basically this thick spray paint that will just cover all the print lines. And you spray it on. It's very soft. It dries really quickly. So it's really easy to hand sand. So forget about trying to use power tools in difficult to reach places. You just hand sand it. There's other things like Smooth On, which is like this gel. To be honest, it's too expensive. If you're trying to do this sort of thing en masse, it's too expensive and too much fiddling around. And the other thing is, when you design your models, try and think about how you're going to finish them as well. So with multi-part printing, if let's say, a really good example is, if I had one sort of smooth surface and I had a bolt right in the middle of it, I can't just get the power sander and sand the whole thing because I've got that bolt and I'll lose the bolt, the detail around the bolt. So maybe print the bolt separately and stick it on afterwards, right? So stuff like that. Just think about how you're actually going to finish it. And I've actually got a hyperlink there. It's probably, you'll know, just Google it. 3D printed techniques for finishing props. There's some functional advantages for making 3D printed props. That is that you can make them work. Now, the pulse rifle doesn't, sadly, but the next model I will have of that's actually quite an old model, will have the reciprocating thing, so you can actually pump it, and you know, you should be able to put the magazine in and stuff like that. So you can start making them a bit more fun, right? You can totally put a Nerf gun in it. It's already been done. You can download that one. But like I made these gauntlets, which sort of go on the arms, and you know, Boba Fett wears them, you know. And so in the animated series, this is what that's from. They have little clips on there, so I made them work just like they do in the movie. And they have an integrated hinge, so that's just a bicycle spoke for the hinge pin. And the thing actually has like a retractable blade that comes in and out. You can't actually see it, sort of hidden in there. But that was just really easy to do, and the whole thing actually, it's functional. But again, you've got to print it, and the printing is the final product, right? So this is stuff you can't really do with other techniques, or not easily anyway. So maybe with injection molding you could do it, but it's just, the thing with this is I actually make it for other people, and I make them to size. So I couldn't use a mold anyway. So I actually print them to people's sizes. 3D scanning. Everyone talks about, why can't you just scan the prop? Well, you can. And this is a bit of an inception thing here. Most of the things, that's actually me standing on the platform in a costume, wearing, being scanned so that we can print that, with most of the stuff that I'm wearing having been 3D printed. So, and then we printed myself. So it's kind of inception. So that's the actual scan, and that's a different one with the helmet off. That's my son, because, you know, it runs in the family. Okay, 3D scanning for prop making. This is actually really interesting. One of the things I love about doing the scanning, body scanning in particular, is that they're normally accurate sizes, so, or more or less. So if you use like the Connect type scanning, which is basically what that is, it's a different brand, but it's the same kind of motion depth. you can actually then use that for doing things like scaling. So in this scenario, this was an animated character called Briareos from Appleseed. Anyone who's a real Japanese animation nut would probably know Briareos from Appleseed. And my son actually wanted this costume. It's this helmet made. So he's a cyborg and he has an eye up here. And you can't really see out of that eye if it's up here. So I had to sort of make it so that my son could actually see out of it. So I just augmented the shape a little bit of the helmet. So I moved the eye down so that it was in line with his head. And I basically scaled it by just chopping off his head and putting the head in the model so that I can use it to scale everything. Because his head was accurate to scale, more or less. So now I could actually work out how big I was going to make the helmet. Because otherwise it's just trial and error. You print like about 30 of them until you get the size right. A friend of mine printed a Boba Fett helmet that, we will never meet. It was sort of Hodor grade. It was just really big. So why did I start doing this? It all started with a rocket. I was making a costume for my son, and I bought this rocket to go on his Boba Fett it goes on his wrist. And I bought it from overseas because it was the only place I could find it, and it cost me like $80. And by the time I got it here, it was made out of resin, and it was broken in like 5 pieces. And I felt really ripped off, and I just thought, it's just a simple thing, and I need to just do it. And I was at Comic-Con, and I'm a member of a Star Wars fan club, and we had the booth next door to the Hackerspace had a table, and they had a 3D printer going, and I was like, man, this is perfect. I can 3D print my rocket. So the first thing I did was model that rocket. It was the first thing I've ever made. Okay, so why? So just some random photos of this crazy stuff. A lot of it's 3D printed. This blaster here, this is Princess Leia's blaster. I actually modeled that based on a photograph. So I just looked at the photograph, I traced it, I just extruded it, and then looked at the history of the blaster. So it was actually some sort of Russian sporting pistol, and found pictures of that, and then sort of added more details. This is what it would have looked like originally before they modified it, because in Star Wars all they do is get a normal gun and stick something on it. That's all you do, and turn scopes backwards. All the scopes are pointing the wrong way. So originally to get a blaster like that as a replica for a costume would have cost like $1,000 because they were just very rare. And now we just 3D print it for like about $10 worth of plastic, which is fantastic. So that's on Thingiverse. You can just go and download it. My son actually, I had originally started designing most of his costume, but by the time he's this age, he's actually designed nearly all of that himself and 3D printed that himself. So he was 14 at the time when he's done most of that. So most of the backpack and everything's all 3D printed. And that's actually me in blue. Crazy. So this is probably one of the biggest things I've printed so far, and it just shows about the value of open source. So you can see BB-8 being printed up the top there, and then my dog deciding to wear BB-8 because that's what they do. And I won't say, but you can. There's a photo on the internet of someone putting a cat inside BB-8 to try and automate it. But so there's BB-8 there. It's full size. It's about that big. I didn't bring it in. It's just too hard. And it's entirely 3D printed. The entire thing is 3D printed. And I actually did it. I printed the whole thing, but models that people shared on the internet. I printed it in 3 weeks, just in time to take it to the premiere of The Force Awakens. And there it is. We're sitting in the cinema for the midnight screening of the first opening, and I actually bought a ticket for it, and it has a seat. The truth is that one of our kids didn't want to go, so I had a spare ticket. So I was like, okay, the droid's taking it. Okay, female makers. So what are the numbers and what are the differences? Okay, so understanding motivation. So one of the things I've seen particularly with the female makers I've met, we tend to have a slightly different focus. So rather than actually focusing just on the technology, we tend to focus on what we want to do with it. For example, I got into 3D printing to print a rocket, a little kind of costume rocket. It was very specific. I wanted to do that as you can go. And then the technology interests me and I started getting into the rest of it. But that was, I had a very end production bias. That's actually what I wanted. And I find that's very common. So I meet a lot of women who want to do, they want to create jewellery, or they've got some other craft type thing they're doing and they want to use 3D printing to augment it. One of the ones that I keep on sort of saying, which is just sort of seems really simple. Have you ever been to a haberdashery type store and looked at all the buttons, right? There's like aisles of buttons, and then they don't even have the one you want. We just 3D print one. Have a library of online buttons. It's plastic. Most of them are just plastic. So you start thinking about that and you go, yeah, it's craft, right? So how does this, is it just like a sewing machine? Is it just another tool? And, there are probably someone like myself, while I tinker with the 3D printers and understand how they work because I have to fix them all the time, right? I am more interested in what they produce. Like one of my printers right now, the LCD is dyed and it's flickering on and off. It's still printing. It's still going to print. It's going to keep on printing until that stops moving. Right? I keep on loading it up and it's just, it looks like it's about to explode. But it still works. It's going to work. And I know a lot of people will look at that and just go, no, you can't run it like that. And it still works. Put a bit of duct tape over it. Yeah. So numbers. So interesting thing is if you start looking at people who identify themselves as crafters versus makers, you actually start looking at even numbers between males and females. It's just not necessarily labeling themselves. So maybe there are just as many female makers, just they use a different label. Maybe. Something to think about though. If you start looking at things like Etsy, for example, so my little online store that I sell my little costume stuff is on Etsy. And you actually start looking at the demographics on Etsy, and it's very craft focused and very female. And there's a lot of 3D printed stuff there. And it may not be labelled as such. So don't go and say, hey, 3D printed blah, because the 3D printed thing will be a part of something else. Again, if you look at Pinterest, the demographics is actually very female. And Pinterest is one of the main feeders into Etsy. So a lot of traffic into Etsy actually comes from Pinterest because people tag and pin stuff they're really into, and it's just one of the main feeders. Again, very high female percentage. So again, what I'm saying is there's probably a case where there's probably a lot of female makers, maybe just not labelling themselves as makers in that sort of sense. Argument for diversity, obviously makes sense. There's commercial aspects, also just adding to the collective ecosystem, and just some crazy stuff like this staff thing is it's a what do you call it? My Little Pony thing, and my son's actually was into it. He's not anymore, but he was at one point. He was really into this My Little Pony brony thing. Right, it's just a phase. All right. But he designed this thing, and it's like a staff that was apparently in one of the shows, and he shared it online and went nuts. And there were people printing this all around the world, right? And when I talk about diversity, it's not just about gender, right? This is something I never even considered. I thought that was diverse, so. I still don't get it. Okay, 3D printing is an enabler. So this is just a really interesting example. I'm not a jeweler, yet I was able to create bespoke jewellery, and it was really easy for me to do it. So it really encouraged me to actually start looking at other things, because all of a sudden I got this loop where I actually was successful at doing stuff, and sometimes that's all you need to get yourself hooked. Also, when it comes to a lot of the females that I've met, a lot of them have a lot of transferable skills, particularly around design. And strong design skills can translate quite well into 3D modeling. It just depends. You have the right mindset. You need to think about the way you model quite differently to an engineering type of problem. So, you need to be able to turn something on its head. Maybe you're looking at the inverse problem. If you want to create a particular model, it's not necessarily about fabricating it out of shapes. It's maybe you need to subtract shapes from something. And being able to think that way is actually something that not everyone can do. And sometimes you need to kind of break the rules. So there's also quite a lot of collaboration amongst female makers, especially the ones I know in the prop circles. We're not as vocal as, I guess, some of the guys, but there's actually quite a few that I'm in contact with, mainly through Facebook and some of the forums. There's also a whole emerging market around wearables and that sort of stuff, and that will probably complement the craft area, but I'm not really sure where that's going or how mature that is. Okay, confidence. Just thinking that you can make stuff that you never thought you could ever make. So this is something I designed. It's a snow speeder from Empire Strikes Back, right? It hasn't actually got all the detail on it just yet because this is the base model. And what I did is I designed this to as a 3D printed thing first. Then I took it apart and said, well, if you're going to make this full size, how would you do it? Right, so we made it full size. But that was based on a 3D model. And what I did with this was I cheated. The underneath is hollow. You go back here. And then what I wanted to do was drop the nose down so that you wouldn't need to build the underneath, because then it'll make it much heavier, and then it's more stuff that you have to build. And that has to be structurally sound. So the whole thing's actually, if you look at the box behind there, the whole thing's actually based on a box. And then the wings kind of just hang on it and they actually sit on the ground. So the whole thing is a prop, but it's been designed to be very simple and easy to put together. I guess the problem with this particular one, though, is we gave it to a guy who used to make race cars, and he built it like a race car, so it has a metal frame in it now, but because he wants to put a motor in there one day and drive it around. It's too wide to go down the road, though. So we have to take the wings off to get on the trailer because it's just way too wide. It takes about 2 lanes. And that's me in another costume that I've done. Open source. Share and share alike. Why it's important. We just spoke about before. The BB-8 is an excellent example of a prop that was being shared online, and I was able to print that without having to go through the whole design effort in like 3 weeks. Mind you, it was like 4 5 printers going at the same time, but I got it done. You need to really think about when you are sharing stuff, how you share it. It's just like code. If you just have one big monolithic bit of code, it's just impossible for anyone to do it. So